Are you ready? Ready to bring a revolution to your relationships? Ready for the experiences on your dating adventure to evolve? Ready for more passion, intimacy, connection, and love in your relationship? Ready to heal past relationship wounds? You're in the right place. I'm Alan, the love engineer, and this is the Relationship Revolutions podcast. In this series, you'll get guidance and tips from me, interviews from other relationship experts, insights from couples who already have a great relationship, and other mind-opening conversations. Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of Relationship Revolutions, where this week I'm joined by Mallorie Rogers, who is an LPC in DFW. What that means is licensed professional counselor in Dallas, Fort Worth, for those of us who are not over in the States. And she specializes in neuro-diversity. So, Mallorie, first two questions. How are you and where are you?
I am good. Yeah, thanks for asking. We're chatting like right in the middle of all the holidays, so I feel like I'm in holiday brain, to be honest. And then where I am, I'm at home. I'm in DFW, physically, and then mentally, I think I'm like orienting to being here together instead of in holiday brain. So yeah, it's good to be here.
Yes, originally I'd actually planned to have these 3 days off, and then I'd two podcasts book in before I'd kind of blanked it out on my calendar. I thought, okay, I'll just do them then. Because sometimes trying to reschedule things, especially when there's time zone differences, it's just so much easier to click the record button and crack on with it. So I'm guessing that being a counsellor specialising in neurodiversity isn't the kind of thing you go straight into from school. So I'm guessing there's some kind of a story between leaving school and becoming a counsellor. So what is that story?
Yeah, man, it's a good question because no, I didn't. Where I went to school, I mean, some schools might be teaching it now, but I didn't even hear the term neurodiversity, neurodivergent, neurotypical. I didn't hear any of that until pretty soon after I had graduated from grad school. And I do think that like TikTok and Instagram, it's probably changed that a lot now because people do come across those terms like on the internet. But where I came across it was at first was I started working with I was the person that I was working under, my supervisor, has a lot of kiddos that were coming to her, and she was like, here, you can, see these kids. And it was like, great. I love doing play therapy. So started off seeing that, and I was noticing a lot of ADHD coming in. And I really appreciated a lot of the like wisdom and guidance that supervisor gave me, but just felt like something was missing when it came to these like ADHD kiddos. It's very behavioral. It was very, like how can we just give them a reward for sitting still? Stuff like that. And I was like, that just seems like we're really missing a big piece of what's going on here. So I ended up finding via like Facebook groups what it means to do like neurodiversity affirming care. That's where I came across a lot of different terms and what fits under that, and got to really dive into some trainings that therapists in these Facebook groups were offering and learn there. And so that was kind of one area, was in this like play therapy, like with kids, kind of dabbling with it a little bit. But then myself, I am a bit of like perfectionist, high achiever type of person. And so just started like advertising that that's who I worked with as a therapist, as a tiny young baby therapist. Was like, I could do that. Like I know how to help those people because I am one of those. And as it turns out, that ended up also being like a lot of the people that were then coming through the door were maybe diagnosed, mostly undiagnosed people, like neurodivergent people. And so really like it's like, oh wait, I'm seeing a lot of the stuff that I've like read about, learned about in all these other spaces here, but these people aren't coming in to address that, and then figuring out kind of from there what that meant and where we go with that.
Yeah.
But so kind of those two pieces, where one kind of started with kids and then another one was like, oh, and really opened up a whole world of stuff that like I didn't learn that in school. And you really, we're coming out with more of them now, but there really aren't very many textbooks either that you can just go to and like learn how you could with like anxiety or depression or trauma or all these other things. It really is kind of its own thing we're learning a lot about now, which is really cool and also means we have a lot of work to do in the like university educational space too.
Yeah. Yeah, I hadn't heard that term for, or when I was at school myself, it was you would just label stickers, two short planks or whatever, and put in that separate class over there. And the first time I heard the term dyslexia was when I was leaving school and going through a trade tests and things, and they said, "Oh, can we see you afterwards, please?" And I thought, "Oh, great, here we go. I failed and all this kind of thing." And they said, "Well, are you dyslexic?" I says, "Well, if you can tell me what that means, I might be able to tell you." So they sort of explained it. I thought, "Yeah, I probably am. Thanks. There's an
Mm-hmm.
excuse or a reason I can explain this stuff." And
Right.
my mum said when she was teaching me to read, she'd get really, really frustrated with me because she found all the academic stuff so easy, and I really struggle with it. And it's only when my dad said to her that, well, look, it's easy for you, but for me and Alan, we read one word or one letter at a time, where you're reading one sentence at a time. And that
Mm-hmm.
shifted something inside her head. And then she got a lot more patient with me, which made a difference. But I hadn't even heard the term neurodiverse until the last 2 years. And the first time I came across ADHD was when I dated a lady who had 3 kids with ADHD, which was certainly a interesting experience.
Mm. It is really interesting too how the more we learn about it, like I was saying, we're doing like lots of learning and education, and really that comes from listening to like lived experience, like the voices of people who have gone through it instead of just whatever we've known to be neurodivergent in the past and just stick everything into that box. So one of the things that has been more recent is like the idea that there's a neurodivergent umbrella. So there's all these different things that can go under that. And so the ones we think of most commonly are like ADHD and autism, and those definitely are under that. And they're the ones we do come across most commonly. But there's all these other ones that we would say fit under there, because what that really means, like to be neurodivergent, is really just that your brain functions, is structured, operates differently from your typical brains, which that all kind of gets pretty relative, right? Because if there were just the majority of the people were neurodivergent, the neurotypicals would be the ones that seem, divergent in a way. But um, we've like now then structured like society and cultures and different things like that around this idea of like what's typical. And so neurodivergent really just means anything that's not kind of, operating in the typical. So when you're talking about that experience with dyslexia, it was different that like your brain processes letters and words this way. And so someone needed to help you like identify that you have that difference. Because if that had been identified earlier on, there's so much that could have been done maybe to like
Yeah.
help you conceptualize how to read, but also just that like narrative I even hear you probably had about yourself and that your mom had, right? You're talking about how that shifted for her just to have a term to
Yeah.
give it of like, oh, he's not just like being obstinate. Like this is his brain works differently. And so we can maybe shift some things around and this wouldn't be so dadgum stressful all the time.
Yeah. No, so I see a lot of differences between the schools now and when I was there, as my other half's a teacher, and she's sort of saying, oh, they have different color paper for different kinds of diversity and different this and different that. And I'm thinking, really? You can't just like give them the same white sheet as everybody else. And interestingly, when she's marking the kids' assignments and tests that are on blue paper, she really struggles with that. So
Mm-hmm.
it's the contrast between when I was at school and what's happening now is completely different.
Yeah, and for someone like me, it's really exciting because it, has been needed for decades that we would start to make these adjustments, but it takes so long to get from like learning something new, right? The whole idea of like know better, do better. But it takes so long to get from, excuse me, the like know better all the way to the do better, like through all these systems that we have. And that's thinking of like in a systemic way.
Yeah.
But when we think of even like how it impacts like dating, that's also like a huge cultural shift, right? What we
Yeah.
expect in the dating world from someone, like that takes forever. That's not just changing like, some laws. That's like a whole other thing. And so it
Oh,
really is
definitely.
it's complicated, and it's cool to see that some of that is shifting. And I think social media gets a lot of bad reps for things. But this is one where I do think it can have a bit of a positive impact because you're hearing directly from the lived experience voices as opposed to having to learn it through some big
Yeah.
um, chain. So,
Yeah. And I think the whole education system, in a way, is geared up for the neurotypical brain. And in some ways, it's almost geared up to create loyal employees that sit down, do as they're told, turn up at the same certain time, leave at a certain time, which doesn't fit most people. We just get
mhm.
conditioned into it. You go to school, get a good job, get a good education. And then once you've got that career, you're sorted for life. And they just don't teach
Yeah,
us life skills, even as neurotypical, let
right.
alone how to navigate the world as neurodiverse.
hmm No, absolutely. There's yeah, definitely so many life skills that are missed. Even something as simple as like how to manage, finances and what does all this stuff mean that you're going to have to be expected to know, but you're never really taught. Um, but when it comes to, the social aspect of people, like I think that they're hoping that we would just pick that up, at least like in, the education system that I grew up in Texas, in the States, like it's just expected that that's just part of like how you go along, right? You're just picking that up by way of like being a person.
Yeah.
And you are, but maybe not always in the best way, right? And that's where I came across a lot of when I started to really notice, like, oh, these people that are coming in, and not all of them are, but the people that are coming in as like identifying as maybe perfectionists or high achievers, or they have really low self worth, they're having relationship challenges. Sometimes it's because that's just how it is, right? The way that you were raised, maybe different things happening in your family, different relationships you've been through, they've torn you down a bit. But for other people, I was noticing like, no, you're just like doused in shame and you feel like you're all the time missing something. You're doing something wrong. You're always the problem. And we've really like broken it down a lot of the time, noticing like, where does all this shame come from? Like, why do you always feel like it's you that's doing something wrong? And a lot of the time it coming from this place of, well, that's just like, I've always felt this way. I've never felt like I have a place to belong, or I've always felt like I have to hide pieces of myself, hide who I really am. And when we track it back, a lot of the time it can start in that educational space of like, well, I don't know, everyone else, seemed like they knew how to read that page in 5 minutes. And so I just had to pretend like I did, but that means my grade suffered because I was faking it. Or sometimes it's the opposite. I was bored to death in school. I was so tired. I was so bored because I think faster. I'm like way smarter than everybody else. And so I'm bored and then I'm distracted because I'm trying to like come up with stuff from my brain, right? But I wanted to feel like I fit in. And so I just like tried to pretend. And so and we have this phrase that's like when you've met one neurodivergent person, you've met one neurodivergent person. So everyone kind of has a different experience. So we're talking in big generalities here, but um it is so interesting how that usually kind of comes with like it's the we internalize it, we just, oh, it was something wrong with me, it's something wrong that I did or that, everyone else, but I'm just gonna I want to fit in. I'm just gonna kind of go with the
Yeah.
flow, and the things that get sacrificed along the way are really hard.
Yeah. And sometimes in that trying to fit in, that's how we lose ourselves in a big way.
Mhm.
Just
Yeah.
not only in life, but in dating and relationships, even with neurotypical people, they get an impression of what their boyfriend, girlfriend's ideal partner would be, and you try and morph yourself into that. If you end up
Yep.
stay in that relationship for too long, then you end up feeling like you don't fit in and the real me can't be seen and all that kind of thing.
hmm Absolutely. And for some people that's worth it, right? Like they just want to feel like they belong so badly that for their entire life they're going to, and then they're able to just push that aside. And then for other people, and that's for them to choose, right? I'm sure you've run into this, but for other people, it's like this huge whole in their mind, in their heart, in their body, because they feel like they've been abandoning a part of themselves
Yeah.
and they can't do it forever, right? So it can, especially when we're talking about like relationships that have been really long term, it's heartbreaking almost for them to have to, choose, like, do I keep having to mask this part of myself if this part of myself isn't welcome in this relationship, or do I do the really scary thing of like trying to make a change here or actually having to leave? Like, that's also, I mean, it's terrifying,
Yeah.
uh, because even though you recognize that there might be something good for you on the other side, it's also a risk and it's scary. And, so, but when you look at the whole picture of what all of I sacrificed within myself all this time, that's a lot sometimes. Sometimes you even
Yeah.
forget who you have been.
Yeah, definitely. Um, I think what a lot of people do when they hear the term autism, then they imagine somebody with the ear defenders on because they don't like sounds and can hardly speak properly and flip out the tiniest little thing, as if it's a scale from your highly functioning normal to you're really, really autistic, and you just everyone's somewhere in that scale. But I think it's more like a wheel where at different times we get triggered by different things and might be blissfully unaware of a lot of them. And then a few years into life, then something happens, some new experience just triggers you, and then a
Mm-hmm.
whole new experience comes along.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting too how you're talking about like that wheel, that is more of how we think of it now. A more like modern approach versus like just high and low functioning is like, let's look at the whole person, let's look at the whole situation. And we think of it like as a big pie. So there's all these different aspects of being autistic or, being an ADHDer. Um, there's even different terms that people would prefer. Most people in the neurodiversity affirming space will say that they prefer like identity first, autistic person. Just as an aside, though, that's why I'm using that language. But some people do still prefer a person with autism as well. So for an autistic person, um, like you're saying, in one relationship, it might be that certain things are accommodated really well, and so it's not like this really big issue, right? Like it's not something that's causing a lot of, based on their own needs, a lot of like conflict or tension. But maybe in a different relationship where those things aren't being accommodated, it is a huge issue because there's maybe an expectation that they would operate or function in a certain way, and that just doesn't work well for them. And you're talking about like the big like headphones and the rocking back and forth and all of that, that's what we tend to think of. And I think right into that a lot of places when I'm working with like teenagers who are either self-identifying or have a recent diagnosis of autism, and their parents just can't believe it because they're like, no way, my kid's not autistic. Like, she can make eye contact. He does really well in school. They have friends, things like that, where it's like, yeah, sure. Stereotypically, we've thought of autism as like the kid who, can't quote unquote function and, they can't speak or communicate. And all of those different things can be pieces of it, but it doesn't have to be that way. And a lot of people have then gotten missed, especially women or people who are assigned female at birth. Like a lot of people have gone like underdiagnosed, or undiagnosed, misdiagnosed for a long time. And one of those most popular misdiagnoses is that women and people that are assigned female at birth are given bipolar diagnoses, borderline diagnoses, these things that, on their own, that's a whole other conversation, but they're very big, scary diagnoses. Usually we think of someone who's bipolar as, out there and unmanageable and all these things that also aren't true. But then borderline is someone who's like, oh, they can't ever be in a relationship. They can't, they can't give, they just take generally. These big things that we think of when we think of those diagnoses, one, that needs to be handled completely differently. But two, it's not even the right diagnosis to begin with. It gets missed because they're just not understood because of this like stereotypical diagnostic criteria of autism, quote unquote. So it's really interesting how all those things are shifting. But when we think about, like, I'm thinking about this in the lens of like you're dating someone, maybe they don't have a diagnosis, but you're noticing these certain characteristics in them. Maybe, um, even just in communication, like that's a huge one that will come up
Yeah.
in relationships. Oh my gosh, communication is huge. And so people just kind of having to interpret what communication or lack thereof means, like that can be a huge piece of like that neurodivergence that if you don't know, if you don't have a word for it, or you don't, maybe the person doesn't know that about themselves, like that really can impact things. So it's,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. And I think a lot of the adult diagnosis comes along from having a child that's neurodiverse. And in the process of them getting assessed, the parents like, that's me. That's me too. That's me too.
Mm-hmm.
That's me too. That, what?
Mm-hmm.
You mean I'm like that as well? That explains so much.
Yeah. Yeah, which is like sometimes that process that you're describing means they're like, wow, how cool. And now I know this about my kid and I also know this about myself. Other times it's more of like, oh no, I see those things in myself, but that's just normal. My kid doesn't have autism. They're not autistic. Because that's just I have that and I'm not autistic, so
Yeah.
that's just normal stuff. They just need to get over it, right? So kind of depending on like where the parent is at with their like new understanding of autism or their like willingness to see that in themselves and be okay with it, can really impact even like the care that the child receives too.
Yeah, definitely. So how do neurodiverse people go about getting into relationships? Because no one gets taught about this stuff in school, and many cases at home either. And that's for the neurotypical. So when it's even
Mm-hmm.
more, well, potentially even more challenging with neurodiversity, how do people
Mm-hmm.
go about navigating that one?
It's a really great question. I think when we start at the beginning of like, how do you best connect with people, right? Like, first, some neurodivergent people, they may do great with like walking into a bar and just like going and talking to strangers. That also may be their worst nightmare, right? But if they just feel like, well, that's the only way you meet people, so I guess either I'm gonna push through and be miserable, or I'm just gonna stay home and never meet anybody, right? So there's so much more variety there of like, what do I like doing? I want to meet someone that like, do I go do an exercise class? Do I go like learn how to do pottery? Do I really love to XYZ hobby? Like, can I, go do that and see if I find someone there? I also think that dating apps can be hit or miss. Just from
Yeah,
what I've seen, like a lot of people that they really love that there's kind of that screen barrier first that
yeah,
they get to kind of practice and not have to, it's not as intense at first, really feel out the vibe. But other people that like also doesn't work because they need to be able to see the nonverbals. They need to be able to like feel the in-person vibe with a person first.
yeah,
And so that's kind of where I guess I land on the you've met one neurodivergent person, so you've met one neurodivergent person. Like each person's going to have to find
yeah.
really what works well for them, but they have to know themselves first before they can really even explore that.
Yeah, I can certainly relate to the walking into a bar and going to speak to somebody that you don't know as being my idea of hell. It's like when I was in my late teens, early 20s, I wouldn't even go to the local pub unless I knew that my mates were going to be there. And
Mm-hmm.
then that changed a lot after going to Australia and New Zealand backpacking on my own for a year. And then
Mm-hmm.
I still found it hard, but it was a bit easier. But when it came to
Yeah.
dating, I did find with the dating apps and online dating was a bit easier because I could let more of the inner me come out before I felt like I was being judged the same way everyone else judged me.
Mm-hmm.
Although a lot of guys struggle with the internet dating because the odds are not in our favor
Right. Yeah.
for many reasons.
I think you an important point in there too of feeling more comfortable with yourself, right? That
Yeah,
it wasn't that you had to just force yourself to go hang out at a bar and when you didn't feel comfortable with it, but that as you got more comfortable with yourself, right, you took the trips, you spent the time with yourself, you just put yourself out there, but you got to go, it sounds like, maybe for the most part,
Yeah.
at your own pace, and that really made a difference for you.
Yeah. And interestingly, one of my best mates, when he found out I was going, he says, "Where are you starting off?" I said, "I'm going to Perth." He says, "No, go to Brisbane. I've got family there and I'll come with you." And I'm thinking, bonus, fantastic, love that. I'm scared of going on my own, but I'm going anyway. And then, to be fair, he did go out to Australia and start off in Brisbane. The only thing is, I'd been back 4 years before he got out there. And we both look back on that time now and think, actually, it worked better that way, because if we'd have gone out at the same time for that 6 weeks or whatever he was looking at being out there, we'd have just gone to the bar, spoke to each other, and then after 6 weeks, he'd be gone. And I'll be like, oh shit. And then that would have been a sudden impact to, I have got to either make friends or get on that plane and go home. Whereas having gone out there on my own, it's straight in at the deep end. And after about a week or two, it's like, actually, most of these people in these hostels are in the same boat. They're on their own too. What could possibly go wrong?
Yeah.
And even if nothing else, no one knows me. So nobody back home is going to find out if I'm making an idiot of myself.
Right. Yeah, it's pretty low risk in that way, right? Like socially low risk. If I do something ridiculous or, that I don't want follow me around, I just leave it behind.
Yeah.
Which is really nice. And that you almost, it sounds like, got to kind of try on maybe some different shoes, right? Like maybe a different version of you that you hadn't really gotten to lean into yet.
Yeah. And I think part of that was because when I went, although I didn't tell anyone at the time, I was trying to run away from all the problems I got here. Funnily enough, I found them over there too. I took myself and I with me. Damn.
Freaking problems. They have a way of sticking with us and popping up wherever we go. We can't leave them behind. But sometimes too, I think it gives us a chance to like look at them from a different lens, or even to embody a different version of ourselves while still having to deal with our problems, which is also really interesting when we think about like neurodivergent folks, like that, like masking is such it's a whole big topic that we could get into, but really it's like partially about I don't feel safe, right? So I'm not going to show you all of who I am. But also there's a reality of like, well, I'm not safe, so I can't, right? For some people, when we were talking about like the rocking back and forth or the headphones, like that is very needed for some people still who are autistic. So not to say that nobody needs that, now, but that version of taking care of our own sensory needs or sensory aversions, like that is a thing. And so, going and traveling or going and putting ourselves out there, even going to a bar, right? Like stuff like that, where if I don't feel safe, there's no way that's going to be helpful for me. There's no way I'm going to be able to like connect with another person in this hostel, in this bar, going to this new exercise class that I'm hoping to maybe connect with somebody, or like there's this girl I've had my eye on or whatever. If I'm not feeling like safe emotionally, physically, whatever, my needs aren't met in any form, then I'm not going to be very like able to connect with other people, because I am so, we would say, like dysregulated in my own brain, in my own body. And so if I can't access that within myself, it's going to be really hard to like lean in and really be who I am while I'm meeting this new person that I'm hoping to form like a deep connection with.
Yeah. It's certainly an interesting area of life to get into, even more so when you're dating someone who's a single parent and they've got one or more children that are neurodiverse. And you see, some parents encourage the children to get out of their comfort zone, and others are kind of helicoptering and trying to protect every tiny little aspect of their life just in case something goes wrong. But what happens when that parent's not there? You're not preparing them for life, I don't think.
Yeah, and it's a tough balance. It's going to be specific to each kid, but it is so hard. Um, well, one, to be that parent, to be the parent that's like doing that constant dance in their head of what is, you're having to anticipate every need of your kid. What are they, we're going to go to this restaurant, or we're going to go to this like outdoor park. We're going to do XYZ event. Oh my gosh, the holidays. We could get into that too. So it is hard. There's a lot of anticipating that they're having to do. And then, I'm thinking about like dating. So like the very beginning of a relationship where it's probably just like the two adults going out and the parents staying home. All of the things that adult that's dating is probably trying to manage like for their kids. Like, my goodness, that's a lot. But a lot of the time that results in difficulty like finding helpful childcare, or having someone that will really like tend to the kids well, or feeling like that anxiety of, are my kids okay without me there? Like as a single parent, that can be a lot. Or just solo parent too. But um, then for the person who's trying to date them, right? Like, are you into this? Like, are you here? Right? Like if they're having to cancel a lot, the kids probably have a lot of needs, which can be really hard when you're going into a new relationship too. Like you're wanting to see that this person's going to like tend to your needs, that this person cares. Um, there's a lot of aspects to it. So I'm curious to hear like your thoughts on that too, and like what you've seen in your experience.
Yeah, I think one of the most challenging experiences for me, well, I've had one or two of those, but one, I was seeing a lady whose son was autistic. He was biologically 8 or 9, thereabouts, but mentally and emotionally, he was still 3 or 4. And we were staying at her house over Christmas one year. I've got my 2 kids there that had been about 8 at the time, so similar sort of age, but emotionally very, very different. And on the Christmas Eve night, she got really upset, saying, "Oh, my son's not having the experience that I wanted him to have, and you need to change the way your children show up and behave to fit this expectation that I've got in my head," kind of thing. And then you look at how her son was actually interacting with the kids, and my 2 were doing anything he wanted to do, showing him how to do stuff on Minecraft and whatever, and absolutely loving it. When she took him to her mother's on Christmas Day for a bit, so she could get some respite, he was saying how much he loved it. And it's like, well, hang on, why do my kids need to change to fit your story when his story is, I'm loving this? And that was
Right.
it's like, how do I process that? How do I deal with that? And if she says anything to my kids, how do I process that and sort of sort them out as well? I thought, man, this is tough. I didn't sign
Yeah.
up for this bit.
Right, right. Well, especially when your kids, it sounds like we're giving him everything that he did need, right? That's more of like that dynamic between the two of you to try and figure out. And it's so tricky. Back to what you were saying earlier, I guess, about the parent who, when they're hearing these different aspects of their kid that might be autistic or might be ADHD, might fit some sort of, term or label, that it's really the parent's own interaction with that that's going to have a big impact. And same thing there, I don't know her story. I don't know anything there, but would be curious right there of like, was it her own need that felt unmet? And that could impact things for a kiddo. What's cool though is it sounds like her son did, based on the story I'm hearing, like
Yeah.
her son did have a really good time, right? And that he did feel that level of safety that we were talking about earlier, of like he felt like he could connect with them, and emotionally very different, right? A 3 to 4 year old to like an 8 to 9 year old. Oh, their bodies might look the same, like emotionally, that's incredibly different. And for them to all be able to kind of
Yeah.
find a way to connect, is really, really sweet.
Yeah. Yeah. And also dated a lady who got three boys. The oldest one was ADHD. The second one was ADHD and ADD. And the third one, he got nothing, but his behavior was exactly the same because he just copied what his big brothers did.
Mm-hmm.
And there was no sort of boundaries or limits in that house that got stuck to. And she was fine with me disciplining the kids and sort of trying to raise the standards of their behavior. But then once I'd gone out to work or left for the week or whatever, she wanted to be their best friend and basically undermining everything that I did. And I think, how's this going to work?
Yeah. It's really tricky. And that consistency, or I guess lack thereof, like, you know, neurotypical, neurodivergent, it doesn't matter. Kids pick up on that really quickly.
Yeah.
Really, really quickly. And when you're looking at like co-parenting or developing like a co-parenting relationship, that's like one of the most important places to start is that. And we could look at that with divorce too, with separation of like,
Yeah.
it's hard enough. There's already a lot that the kids are going through. Let's offer them as much consistency as we can between homes, which is, I mean, easy to say, very, very hard to do. But they do, they pick up on it because they're looking for their caregiver, whoever that person is, to be consistent. That helps them learn that they're safe. And so I would imagine just such a hard place for you to be of like trying to give these kids what you can tell that they need, and then also feeling like it's just all for naught.
Yeah. And then what I've seen sometimes is the parent of the neurodiverse child will kind of almost sometimes use that neurodiversity as an excuse for less than great behavior. It's like one of them actually kicked his mum, and I'm like, that's not acceptable, and trying to sort of establish boundaries. She's like, oh, it's okay, he can't help it, is because the way his mind works and everything. But even if you're neurodiverse, in my opinion, or certainly in most cases, you can still learn the difference between right and wrong. It may take longer.
Yeah. Well, and what I would be looking at there is what's underneath the that kid that kicked his mom. Like, there's something going on there, right? Like, there's an unmet need that he has, that someone's not meeting, and there do have to be boundaries. Like, there do have to be like, maybe it's not that you can kick me, but you can pinch me. Maybe I'm okay with that for now as we like scale down this behavior. But at the end of the day, if we just stopped there, if we just stopped with like, well, because I do agree, like he probably can help it to a degree, what she was saying. But if we just stop there, we're not really getting the kiddo what he needs, you know? Looking at like, was he overstimulated? Were there kids running around everywhere? And so he just like couldn't process it. Was it that the lights were really bright? Is it that there's something that hurts in his body, but he doesn't have the way to identify it because that concept of interoception, being able to like know what's happening in our bodies and give it words, and understand it. Like a lot of the time, neurodivergent people struggle with that a lot more. So maybe his tummy hurt, maybe he had a headache, maybe his ears were hurting, or his throat was sore. Maybe it was like he had someone that hurt his feelings like 3 days ago, but he hasn't emotionally processed it yet, because that's also something that can be more difficult, is the ability to like understand and name emotions for neurodivergent folks. So, there's like so many other things that it's like, well, we will probably have to kind of pause and really get to know this. And it'd also be nice if we could completely understand every single thing about our kids. And sometimes we just can't either. But yeah, it's a lot of work to get to understanding and identifying that need, and then being able to like meet it. And that takes so much time, and we're not going to get it right every time, and that's fine. But being able to kind of show our kiddo that we're helping them figure out what their need is, and then for now we're going to meet it. But the hope is that at some point they're able to advocate for themselves. They're able to say, this is what I need, instead of us having to be the investigators every single time. And also with us, but then also were they to grow up and enter a relationship one day, now they feel confident in identifying their own needs, and that helps them know like, I don't want to be in a relationship with a person who, when I express a need, they don't need it, because that's not going to get me where I need to go.
Yeah. Yeah. What just came up for me is something that I heard Tony Robbins say, and he says that any action or behavior that a human being does is either an act of love or a cry for love in some way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So if it's not loving behavior, well, what does it take for them to feel loved in that moment? What's behind it, as you say?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I agree with you so much there. And sometimes that need is, like you were saying, like structure, boundaries. No, we're not
Yeah.
going to hit mom. You're not going to hit mom right now. Here's something else we can hit. Here's a pillow. Let's go outside and, you know, beat up an old toy. Let's, whatever we need to do. Chop some wood. But other times it's not so much that boundary. It might be identifying that other need. So yeah, it's a hard dance
Yeah.
to do, especially at the beginning of a relationship where you don't really know the other person yet very well, that you don't know their kids yet very well. And you're figuring out, like, what are the rules here? Like, what are our own boundaries with how we parent one another's kids, or how we interact with one another, based on our own needs, right? Like that person, kids aside, when you're starting to date somebody or you're learning more about them, maybe you've moved in together, so you're seeing a whole bunch of new stuff that you haven't seen before. And they have, what we would call maybe like a meltdown, or they're really emotionally upset or dysregulated by something, and it makes no sense to you at all. It seems like everything was fine, and then all of a sudden they're like screaming or crying or threatening to leave, and you're like, whoa, what happened here? And same thing there. It's either expressing that love, expressing that everything's good, or it's expressing that, like, there's something that has gone amiss here. And it may not be that you necessarily did anything wrong just then. Maybe you triggered something else. Maybe, it was something that had just kind of been like adding up throughout the days, and they didn't have the words for it yet, or they didn't pause to really process it on their own yet. And that's something they'll have to work on and grow in. So it really does impact all those different layers and levels of relationships.
Yeah. Yeah. Because we're not taught about emotions in school, or we certainly haven't been in the past. I think they might
Mm-hmm.
touch on the surface of it now. But even as parents, if we've not been taught how to process, regulate, and let go of our own emotions, how can we teach our kids to?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we can, but man, it's so much more exhausting if you haven't done it, yet before you enter parenthood. That's one of my favorite things to tell, like, even friends that are like, hey, what should I put on my baby registry? What should I, do before, I have a baby? And it's like, I'm like, go to therapy. Like, go to therapy, to not because, I don't really think that therapy is for people who are broken or wrong. Like, I really think it's for everybody, but just to go understand yourself better.
Yeah.
Go understand what makes you tick, go understand more of, like, the relationships or the emotions that you like to avoid the most, in yourself and then in other people. What do you tend to dismiss the most? What do you gravitate towards? Like, all these things are really good to know, because then when you go into parenting, it's like your 1-year-old is, they just threw a block at your head, and now you have to decide how to respond. It's way easier if you've already worked through some of your own emotional baggage to figure out how you want to respond in that moment.
Yeah.
But if you don't, right, you're just going to respond out of what is most natural to you, which is usually the way we've been treated or the way we've been parented.
Yeah.
And if that aligns with your values, great. But a lot of the time, I think we're finding that it doesn't. For people, they're wanting to kind of do things a little bit differently, and that just takes, it takes effort on the front end.
Yeah. Yeah. The number of times I've heard my parents come out of my mouth is unreal.
Yeah.
And on top of that, because when I stepped out of line as a kid, I'd often get a sore rear end.
Hmm.
And at times I get tempted to do that myself. I'm like, oh, hang on a minute. Where's this come from?
Right. Yeah. It just kind of comes out of us, right? Um,
Yeah.
and and sometimes those are things that we wanted to do, right? It just comes naturally, but those we're not really having to do very much about. Like, that's just what's going to flow out of us, is what we've been taught, what we've seen, what we've heard. And so one of the other cool things I think is impactful about social media is really for parents looking at like, who am I following, like in the parenting sphere? Who am I allowing to like influence the way that I think about kids, the way I conceptualize parenthood, right? Am I following a bunch of people that are like, motherhood is martyrdom, like, and it's just horrible and I hate it and why am I here? Like, that's fine to have a couple of those, but if that's everything, then yeah, you're gonna be, pretty feel oppressed in your
Yeah.
parenting journey. But maybe to have a mix or to have people who are like giving helpful strategies or things like that. I find that humor in any type of, in parenting, in relationships, like having maybe that's like funny accounts that you follow on social media or just having friends who are like, man, yeah, you really did blow up at her the other day whenever whenever your 4-year-old yelled at you, you just let her have it. And that's not who you are as a mom. And also like hilarious that you called her a, whatever
Yeah.
foul word you used for her kind of thing. um,
Yeah.
Cultivating like the people that are speaking into us as parents.
Yeah. And also, I think an experience I had was about a year ago with my current partner. We dropped her youngest off at nursery school, and then we got the 8-year-old, and said something about, if we drop her off and then we got the choice, we can either walk across the road to the DIY store to pick something up, and then we'll go and get a hot chocolate from Costa, or we can drive across the road and go home. And I thought, well, that's interesting wording. And so we drove across to the DIY store, got what we needed, and then went home. And the boy had a meltdown because he thought he was getting a hot chocolate. He's like, but you said, and so I thought, so I let that kind of settle, and then just took her in to the other room and said, oh, by the way, this was what I heard when you were talking. What were you trying to say? And did he hear the same thing? She says, I had no idea it could be received that way. So she went and spoke to him and says, like, well, what did you hear me say? And it was a very different story to what she'd thought she'd said. So she made him a hot chocolate at home and kind of kept the peace a little bit. And she says, thank you. Because his dad would have let rip into me and undermine me in front of the kids. I said, well, how does that help any of us? I said, besides, I wouldn't like you undermining me in front of my kids, so why should I do that to you?
No, it was a really sweet way of, because how else that could have unfolded is, you do undermine her, you do get onto her, like, well, you promised him this, you said we were going to do this, right? Which now she's feeling shame because she was like, oh, I thought we were going to do a fun thing, and here I am, like, I messed this up, or how dare you tell me how to parent my kid? Like, I know exactly, like, that's not his problem, this is his problem, right? Like that defensiveness. And then you're mad because she didn't receive your feedback very well, and the kid's mad, and everyone's mad and upset. And instead, you offered her that moment of connection. Like, hey, do you maybe see where this went wrong and maybe how we could do it differently another time? And then that was regulating for her. She had the emotional capacity to then be like, okay, I understand that I did something, that was not communicated well and I could do better next time. How about when we go home, now we make the hot chocolate there? We didn't get to do the things you thought we were going to do, both of them, but we can do both of them a little bit, right? Like, we went to the store and then now we're going to go home and make the hot chocolate. Like that. Now everybody's way more connected. The day probably flowed way better than it would have had you had that, like, maybe gut reaction of her previous partner, or maybe that would have been a previous reaction for you even. But it's hard to like do that in the moment, right? I think it's way harder to put in the effort in the moment of, okay, what maybe happened here? Let me give myself a second to think. Let me give her the benefit of the doubt. Let me give the kid the benefit of the doubt. Like, that's way more work in the moment. It's way easier to just like jump on somebody. But in the end, it's worth it.
Would I have approached it or processed it the same way if I hadn't learned how to be a coach? Probably not. Because when you go through that training, it all starts with going within and looking at your own behavior and think, actually, I could have done this 1,000 different ways. But why did I choose that one?
Yeah. It's so impactful. And I think it's also cool to think about that kiddo getting to see that modeled. I don't know, if that conversation was really where kiddo could see it or not, but to see the change right in that dynamic between the two of you as well. Like kids are not, we like to say that kids are not great interpreters, but they're really great observers. So they're always watching, they're always, kind of trying to download what's happening around them. And then usually subconsciously, they're interpreting it. And usually they're assuming it's about themselves. Like usually if
Yeah.
parents are fighting, mom's not getting along with grandma, whatever, they're like, oh, I've done something wrong. Let me be on my best behavior. Let me fix it.
Yeah.
Or maybe they're defeated in it too. Like, well, maybe there's just nothing I can do. I'm just that bad of a kid, whatever. So when they see that repair happen, I can believe that they are able to be repaired with, right? And also the pressure is relieved that like, oh, it wasn't me. And
Yeah.
even more so with neurodivergent kiddos, right? Like sometimes they're going to have a harder time picking up on the cues, maybe verbal, maybe nonverbal, that other people are putting down. So harder for them to interpret some of those things. So they're just even more so going to assume that it's something wrong with them, that maybe I'm bad and that's why everyone's arguing.
It's an interesting question that's just come up for me. Are you familiar with Gary Chapman's 5 love languages?
Mm-hmm.
Do they still show up in the same way with neurodiversity, or would that be
Well,
different?
I don't want to, yeah, I don't want to speak for all of them. I will say yes. I mean, a lot of them will still identify, with different aspects of that. Um, I think the one that I see the most maybe deviation from would be like physical touch. Um, and not so much that they don't want physical touch, but that sometimes they need a different kind. So sometimes they really like a really deep hug. Like they really don't like light, gentle, really caressing. Like that can sometimes be really overstimulating for them. But yeah, I mean, quality time, words of affirmation, gifts. What else am I missing? Touch. There's one more, but yeah, I mean, I do
I'm
find
glad
that they
I'm not
tend
the
to
only
still
one that can
pick on those.
only remember 4 in those special
Yeah,
moments.
it's always just four, and sometimes it's a different four, and I forget the other one. But whichever one it is, I do think it still relates. Definitely, I think just kind of little adjustments for some of them, which is also probably the truth for
Yeah.
everybody.
Yeah, the one you missed off the list was acts of service.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
It's I normally forget gifts because it's not part of my dialect. So
Mhm. Yeah, which is funny that I forgot acts of service because that's like one of my top ones. Gifts would be like the last one, but I remembered it this time, probably because of the holidays. I don't know, but it's funny.
who knows? Crazy. It's interesting
Mhm.
how our minds work.
Mhm. Yeah, it's really funny. No, but that is a good question, thinking about like how that relates. And it brings up that kind of overall thing of really, it really does matter that you get to know the partner that's in front of you, right? And we're talking about if you're the neurotypical and you're trying to date someone who's neurodivergent, or you are in a relationship with a neurodivergent person, or they have neurodivergent kids. But it's also difficult if you're the neurodivergent person and you're dating a neurotypical, you have no idea, right? Like it's hard for you to even conceptualize what might be
Yeah.
important to them or what they might need. And so, um, really getting to know like the individual in front of you, asking those questions, being open to, you know, dialogue of what is it that you need that you're not getting here? What am I doing well? Like what works well for you? Also knowing that all of that changes over time, a lot of it, not all of it. Different needs and different seasons. And then because usually, and you know this, usually what's really difficult in a relationship is communication. Like communication is one of the most
Yeah.
difficult like things. And so like if I'm having a hard time being honest about like what I need emotionally or what I need like in an intimate setting with sex, like if I'm having a hard time saying that, there's a barrier there and I need to know about the
Yeah.
barrier, right? Not just necessarily shove myself and push myself through. Like yes, that you're going to have to challenge
Yeah.
yourself, and maybe the challenge you start with is like getting to know more about like what is that barrier for me, um,
Yeah.
and work through that.
And I think especially with things like sex, even for us neurotypicals, we're conditioned and told for many, many years, don't talk about sex. The most common thing you hear as a boy, don't touch your willy.
Mm-hmm.
And girls are always being told to cross the legs and not show their knickers and all this stuff. So you have that drummed in for so long that you don't find it easy to talk about it with your partner or a potential partner, and let alone to ask for something you like.
Mm-hmm.
Or say,
Yeah, it's
actually, I don't like this.
right. Yeah. It's just this thing that, I mean, when we look through the lens of like purity culture, it's just, you have to do that, right? You have to do it at some point. You have to, whatever. Or it's maybe you shouldn't enjoy it, right? It's not something that you should enjoy, right? Where you're talking about like something you can ask for, that you can get creative with. Like that's a whole other thing as well. But if you already feel that level of like deep shame of I don't fit anywhere, I don't belong anywhere, I'm always doing things wrong, my brain doesn't work the right way, I just need to work harder, push harder to make my brain function and fit the way that it's supposed to fit, that's definitely going to show up in sex too. The needs you have, the aversions that you have, the time of day that you operate best in can impact that. Night owl, early bird, all these different things. Sensory overload, right? When we think about sex and sensory overload, that can be massive. Um, so yeah, it's a huge, huge, huge piece of just being a human, but we've also been denied for a long time, denied that space to explore that part of each person,
Yeah.
of ourselves. And so when there's that much shame around it, it's hard to even get started with that. And so
Yeah.
that openness in a relationship is really important to be able to like talk about that, but also being gracious with ourselves if it's not something that's easy to dive into, because it's got like layers and layers and generations of no's and shame,
Yeah.
behind it.
Yeah. Yeah. Because just look, like 4 or 5 generations ago, you're probably in the Pride and Prejudice area of life, and it's totally different back then. And talking about intimacy at that time would be an absolute no-no. And it's
Mm-hmm.
slowly opened up a little bit over the years,
Mm-hmm.
but it's different again now. When my kids are older, it'll probably be different again.
Mm-hmm. Which is another layer of difficulty when you're the parent, right? Trying to figure out like, okay, as these tides are changing, I want this to be different for my kid. And also like, what does that mean? What does that mean for what I want them
Yeah.
having access to, or how I want them, embracing themselves and things like that. So it's a really complicated conversation. It kind of goes back to what you're talking about with co-parenting too. Like, whenever you're merging your life with someone else or trying to help, you know, parent each other's kids, that's a whole other thing too that's really complicated, because it not only what do we do now, but it comes with all of our baggage, um, from
Yeah.
what we've been taught and what we've experienced as well. So
Yeah. Because well, we don't get any instruction manual with our own biological kids, and then as a step parent, there's even less.
mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 And there's books you can read and there's podcasts you can listen to and everything. But, and all of that can be very helpful. But at the end of the day, each kid's unique. Each family
Yeah.
structure, each family dynamic is unique. And so it is kind of starting a little bit from scratch with all of them. Or maybe you start with this like foundation of what you want to try to make work, and you learn very quickly what works and
Yeah.
what doesn't work. So, yeah, I guess that grace there for yourself, and then also the creativity of like, okay, if this isn't working, like, frankly, screw whatever advice is coming from a professional. If it's not working, like, I need to find something that works. And so, with that, I'll even give the plug to like for people with their therapists. Like, if you feel like the advice you're getting, the guidance you're getting is making things worse over a long period of time, it's not working. Like, it's okay. Just because
Yeah.
it comes from a professional, like, doesn't mean that you have to just keep pushing until you make it work. And I think that's one of the things I've seen too with, you know, marketing as a neurodiversity affirming therapist and operating as that kind of therapist, the kind of counselor, I get people that come to me and they're like, I've done therapy before, but I just felt like I was failing because I could never really make work what the therapist was saying to do. I see that a lot with ADHD and autism. That also relates to relationships. If I was trying to just really make this thing work because my therapist said it was supposed to, but it's not working, that might not be a me problem. And therapy is not going to feel easy. It's supposed to be challenging, right? It's supposed to be difficult to like process through these things
Yeah.
and change behavior patterns and all of this stuff. Totally. But that comes with a big caveat that it should at some point be changing things for the better. And so I like to encourage people, and I tell my own clients that, like, if this isn't working, if this doesn't feel like it is a good fit for you, I tell them usually to give it 3 to 5 sessions. And if it's not feeling like that, then I will help you find someone.
Yeah.
I will give you, a few different options to go and find someone that feels like a better fit, because you're wasting your time and money here. And that's not what I want for you. So, um, yeah, a little point there for people. I think sometimes people need that permission.
Yeah.
And that relates to all different aspects of yourself: parenting, relationships, executive functioning, right? Even just the ability to get out of bed or like find a shower routine that works for you. Like all of that can play in therapy. And you want a therapist who's going to be able to kind of like see where you're at and help you there instead of trying to bring you
Yeah.
where they think you should be.
Yeah, because some people, talking therapy works really, really well. Others, CBT may be better. Someone else might be hypnotherapy. Somebody else
Mm-hmm.
might be NLP or kinesiology. All these different options are available. But
Mm-hmm.
certainly in England, the NHS doesn't provide that. Just you go see a doctor and they'll prescribe you some drugs, which doesn't necessarily solve any problem. It's good at masking it.
Mm-hmm.
But if you actually speak to somebody who understands that specific niche area of life, you get a very, very different result.
Yeah, definitely. And pre-medication, I think medication can be really helpful for so many things. And usually, even from what we've seen in research, it is best with, like, in tandem with something else.
Yeah.
And, you talked about the different kinds of therapy, and absolutely, that's, what I'll tell people is we can kind of incorporate different things that do feel good to you. But at the end of the day, if you need a specialization in a theory that I don't really provide or don't know a whole lot about, I just don't see that it's very helpful to you, that I just like, we
Yeah.
push through here, right? Like you can go and do maybe that type of therapy somewhere else. Or, get a need met. And then if you want to come back here, can. But a lot of people are scared because they're like, but my whole story. I don't want to tell the whole story again. And I get that. I totally get it. I've done that too. But also, if you're not getting what you need,
Yeah.
why are you here? But it's the same thing in the States you were talking about. Like, most of the time it's, well, have you talked with your doctor, right? Have you gone to see your doctor? And that's great, but doctors aren't really trained, at least not here,
No.
to know really much about that. They'll just kind of say, some of them are starting to kind of give a referral for therapy, but even still, they really don't know what that could help with. They can't, educate the patient on what that might look like, or all the different kinds of therapy that they might go to receive, so especially if we're looking at like something like ADHD or autism, there's certain types of therapy that are like, have historically been the ones that they'll recommend. So like for autism, the number one, like, quote unquote, gold standard that for a long time has been recommended is ABA therapy. But when we listen to the lived experience, like the voices of people who have that lived experience, they've grown up, adult, actually autistic people, a lot of them have found ABA to be, frankly, pretty traumatizing. And so when we listen to those, we can't really refute that, right? So for some people, they do not feel that way. Some people feel that it was very helpful. They're very thankful for it, all of that. But they, a lot of the time, the referral is, we'll just go to this one type of therapy and that'll fix it and make it better. And sometimes it makes it worse or makes it better in the short term, but in the long term, it's way worse. And so just knowing we have
Yeah.
options, right, to educate on, a lot of doctors just don't know that. And if they did, I bet that they would share, the options. It's also something that's really hard to research. And so when, a parent will say, well, give me the research on a different type of therapy. And I'm like, you know what? Like, I can point you in the direction of lived experience voices. I can show you, these different things that
Yeah.
some people are sharing. We're starting to do a little bit more research, but at the end of the day, it is a little bit harder to research that. And so you will just have to kind of go with your parent gut on that one. And that's so hard. That's really, really hard.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. As I read somewhere that says, well, one of the reasons that the medical world, if you like, don't recommend alternative therapies is because healthy people don't need drugs. They lose customers.
Yeah, same thing with insurance. I don't know what insurance is like in England, but I mean, it's a whole messy system in the States. And, alternative therapies, like insurance is going to take one look at that sometimes and say, like, no.
Yeah.
Or they decide, well, three sessions should cut it. And, we're, as the therapist, looking at this person has a massive trauma history and they have all these things that they need to work through. And you want me to do that in 10 sessions? Like, they're barely comfortable here in 5 sessions. And so it's just not designed, in a way that truly is like pro patient, pro client, in my opinion. And that is, it gets really sticky when you're trying to advocate for your client or your patient. And also, if you're on an insurance panel, make that happen.
Yeah. Yeah, I think was it, are you familiar with Gabor Mate?
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
watching the podcast he did with Joe Rogan recently, and he was saying that from his perspective, there's no such thing as ADHD. He says,
Mm-hmm.
because we all have that natural fight, flight, freeze. But when you're a child, if you're feeling uncomfortable, you can't always run away. And if the person's 10 times bigger than you can't fight. You can freeze for so long, but then you run out of options. But that emotion and that fear and everything else still stays in the body. So what's a natural reaction? It's going to be to lash out in some way. And it becomes a coping mechanism. And then it stays throughout life. Does that sort of have any resonance for you, or?
Yeah. Well, he's a brilliant human being, and I've learned a lot from him. I don't fully agree with him on that one. That's a hot take. People disagree with me on it all the time. But I do think, based on what we do know about the structure of certain brains, that it is a real thing. I do, though, see a huge increase in the amount of people who identify with ADHD symptoms. And it has me just wondering if maybe over time our brains are morphing, right? Like they are
Yeah.
changing. And so more of us are internalizing, right? Like our brains are maybe more structured that way, that generationally we know that trauma goes back so many generations. It lives in
It certainly
our
does.
bones and our bodies. And so I think that, he's touching on something there for sure. But where I really tend to disagree with that is more so than in how we treat it, right? Like how to and treat in terms of therapy, but also treat in terms of address. Like how do we look at it? How do we think
Yeah.
about it? Because I think some people have heard, the amazing Gabor Mate say that, and they're like, oh, well, then I'm making my ADHD up. Or if my parents had just done something different, my brain wouldn't work that way. And I think that's an oversimplification of what he's saying, but I
Yeah.
also think it's important to for me to make that distinction, because it's not that. I do think it probably has been impacted by generations of this, but there's nothing that my parents could have done about that for my brain. Like that had to be 10 to 12 generations back potentially. And so, yeah. And something else that um, I love how he also weaves in the ADHD and the trauma. Like we need to look at both of those together,
Yeah.
because that's something that is a misdiagnosis a lot of the time too. Like you were saying, like we look at it, especially in the education system. When ADHD medication for kids first really came out, it was like this massive push. Every kid needs to be on, XYZ medication. And so a lot of the time they were medicated. But I think important to look at, like, well, what does this kid got going on at home? Like maybe the, big emotions, the big behaviors they're having are not just because they're having a hard time focusing. It's not just because they have ADHD. They might. And also, is there a trauma history? Do we need to be paying attention? And some people would consider like complex PTSD as under that neurodivergent umbrella as well. Same thing with, because it does change the structure of our brains. Same thing with an ABI, an acquired brain injury or traumatic brain injury, because it can change the way our brains function or structure or operate. So they would also put that under that umbrella, which is really interesting to me as well.
Yeah. So if somebody's listening to this and thinks, wow, I'd really like to speak to Mallorie and learn more from her take, or even work with you, what's the best way for them to find you or get in touch with you?
Yeah, so I am on Instagram, just at Mallorie Rogers. So first and last, Mallorie has an IE at the end and a D in Rogers. And then same thing, I have a website, MallorieRogers.com. So can go to that. If they're looking to connect for therapy, I can see people in the state of Texas, but I have a way to connect with me through that on that website, or they can go to the website for the practice that I work at as well, which is the Couch Therapy. And we're based in Texas, so anyone that's there can connect there as well. But I would love to chat and connect.
Beautiful. And final question, as this podcast is called Relationship Revolutions, if there was one thing that could bring revolution or evolution to the world of dating and relationships, what would that one thing be?
I think assuming the best of one another. I really do. Yeah.
Beautiful. As we almost naturally look for flaws and faults in others and in ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We assumed the best for them and for us.
Yeah.
I think it would just be disarming, right? We wouldn't quite start on the defense or the offense. It would just be,
it's almost like staying in that early in love infatuation stage where nobody can do anything wrong.
Yeah, which would be really nice. That's how it works. Yeah, that in recognizing that, like, I feel like at the beginning, a lot of time, that they're probably going to do something eventually, but for now, it's really nice. But it's going to hit eventually. So having that assumption of like, if I can just hold on to what it felt like before, of like, oh no, they just love me and they just, doing everything nice and good all the time. If I can hang on to just a piece of that whenever conflict arises, makes a big impact.
Beautiful. Mallorie, thank you for joining us today and sharing your time and your wisdom with us. I found it really, really interesting, and no doubt we'll speak to you again at some point in the online space fairly soon.
Sounds good. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for listening. And if you haven't already, please leave me a review on your preferred podcast platform. Click the like button and also subscribe so that you get the new episode notifications. I'm curious, what did you take away from this episode? Please share your takeaways with me. Send me an email to relationship-revolutions@theloveengineer.rocks.